Hey everybody, can you hear me? Okay, I'm starting my stopwatch, which I will consult many times to make sure I'm on track. So, hi everybody, I'm here and I'm really happy to be here to speak about the science underlying parental alienation. And as we know, this is a dark and sad topic. That's why I usually wear black when I give my talks. But we do have to start with humor, and I don't know how to move the slides. So the joke is on me. I don't know how to do this. Anybody know? So we need a clicker. Okay. Okay. So you can, okay, now we're not in sync here. Okay. That's what I want to show you. Okay. So this cartoon came out the week my first book came out. So I thought that was kismet. So you can see the guy on the right here in the dark suit. Life has taken a bad turn for him. He's nursing a drink. He has Band-Aids on his face. He's had a rough go of it. And the caption says, "Since we don't have any children, my ex turned the cats against me." All right. And so I know it is pretty funny. So, but what I love about it is that it shows that there are certain types of people who can't share. And if there's children, they're going to fight over the children. And if there aren't children, they're going to fight over the dogs. And if there aren't dogs, they're going to fight over the cats. And that the other thing that this cartoon shows, that it really hurts to have your beloved turned against you, whether that beloved is a child or a dog or a cat. And so what I want to do today is talk about the science that is underlying this phenomenon of having a child turned against you. Okay. So I feel like these aren't exactly the slides that I had intended, so I'm a little disoriented here. Okay, so the question that I want to pose is, how do we know if a child has in fact been turned against a parent, right? How do we know if a child who's rejecting a parent, their hands are on their hips, I hate my mommy, I hate my daddy, I don't want to see that parent, and you'll notice I'm going to go back and forth with the genders because we know this happens to everybody, both moms and dads. How do we know if a rejecting child is an alienated child, right? And embedded in that question is a really important point, which is that not every child who rejects a parent is in fact alienated, right? We use the term alienation to refer to children who are unjustifiably rejecting a parent, and we use the term estrangement for children who are realistically rejecting a parent, okay? And so the point is that we can't just look at a child who's rejecting a parent and say, we know that that child is alienated or not. Okay, so the model that we've developed, and I know there's a little bit of, is it 4 or 5, but as the sort of the person who first coined this phrase, the 4-factor model, I'm going to stick with 4 factors. Okay, so the 4-factor model says that we need 4 things to be in place for us to know that a child is in fact alienated when that child is rejecting a parent. And we have to look at all of the behaviors of everybody, not just the child, right? So according to the 4-factor model, you need to look at the behaviors of the parent who's being rejected. That's factors 1 and 2. Did the parent have a good relationship with the child at one point? Did that parent engage in abuse or neglect? Then we look at the behaviors of the favored parent, and then we look at the behaviors of the child. Okay, and there's the picture that I wanted to show you. You see that child? That is not a happy child, right? This one, not so happy either. But we can't tell just based on this. The strength of the child's rejection, the strength of their conviction is not related to the truth of whether they're alienated or not, okay? So I already answered this question. How can we tell if a child is alienated or estranged? Okay. We need to see those 4 factors. And now I'm going to ask, why does it matter? Why do we care if the child is alienated or estranged? We know they don't want to see a parent, right? And the reason it matters, I'm going to tell you the answer, so that was a rhetorical question. The reason it matters is because the treatment path would be very, very different. Okay? If we have an alienated child who's been manipulated by a parent to reject the other parent, then they need an alienation-specific legal and mental health set of remedies. And if the child is estranged, they're realistically rejecting a parent, that would be a very different set of legal and mental health remedies. And we would not want to put an abused child who's estranged in alienation treatment, nor would we want to put an alienated child in abuse treatment, right? Abuse-specific treatment is where the parent learns to be a better parent and the child gets to express their justified anger and upset with the parent. We wouldn't want to mix those two kinds of treatments up. Okay, so the four-factor model takes into account the behaviors of all the parties, and it ensures that an abused child is not mistaken for an alienated child. Okay, and there's factor one. It's the prior positive relationship between the child and the now rejected parent. It takes into account the normative flaws, right? All parents are imperfect, right? And the question is, was this parent who's now being rejected a normative parent? Their flaws are not the kind of flaws that would result in a child rejecting them, even though they are an imperfect parent. And if that's a yes, then we proceed. Factor two is their absence of abuse or neglect on the part of the now rejected parent. And we care about that because we want to rule out the alternative explanation. Is it alienation or estrangement? And I'm going through this fast. I know everybody kind of knows a lot of this at this point, and I want to get to the science underlying this. Factor three is that the favored parent is engaging in many, does not have to be all, of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. And again, I'm not going to list them. I know everybody knows where to find them. But the point here is that we want to see that the parent is doing the kinds of things that we know can foster a child to unjustifiably reject the other parent, right? So that's the denigrating and the limiting contact and referring to the other parent by his or her first name. Those are the 17 examples of the 17. Okay, and factor four, the child's exhibiting many of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. We want to see that the child is behaving like an alienated child. Okay, so the premise underlying everything I just said is that children can be manipulated to unjustifiably reject a parent, right? If we did not believe that children could be manipulated to believe something about a parent that's not true, then alienation wouldn't exist, right? If we were all impervious to undue influence, it would be impossible for one parent to manipulate a child to reject the other parent. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I want to do is talk about the science of social influence. Okay, because we have to understand how is it possible and what does the research say about whether people can be influenced. And by the way, nobody thinks that they personally can be unduly influenced. Everybody says, no, I'm picking out that brand of laundry detergent because I know it's better. But, you know, there's millions of dollars that go into every aspect of the packaging and the name and where it is on the shelf. None of us are impervious to being influenced. Okay, so when scientists wanted to learn whether babies had what's called depth perception, which is that they can see in 3D, they invented a really interesting technique to study that called the visual cliff. And the visual cliff is a table, and painted on the table, halfway through it looks like there's a cliff. But you can only see it looking like a cliff if you have depth perception. So if you put a 2-month-old on that cliff, they're going to walk on the table, they're going to walk right across the table, crawl right across the table, because they don't see that it looks like a cliff, right? And when babies get to be around 9 months of age, you put them on the table and they stop because they have depth perception now, and it looks like they're going to fall off the cliff. So that has nothing to do with alienation. But what the scientists figured out is that even once babies have depth perception, if you put the mommy, and they did this a long time ago when mommies were the primary caregivers, they put the mommy on the other side of the table and smiled and showed positive affect and encouragement, the little babies who have depth perception will crawl across the table, even though it looks like they're going to fall off a cliff. The cues from the mother are overriding the child's own visual information of what they are seeing with their eyes. And what happens if you have the mother on the other side of the visual cliff, frowning or looking afraid or disgusted? The babies don't go, right? They're using social referencing. They're using information from another person to override their own visual perception. Okay, so that's our first little inkling, right? Even little babies can be sort of manipulated or influenced to put more stock in what somebody else is telling them than what they are seeing with their own eyes. Okay. And I'm sure you can all sort of imagine you've seen in a playground a child who falls down, and they look at the parent, and if the parent says, oh, kaboom, baby went kaboom, and the child gets up and sort of goes off happily playing. And if the baby falls down and looks at the mother, or again, father, and the parent says, like, oh, my poor baby, what happened? Are you safe? Are you okay? And then what happens? The baby like bursts into tears. Oh, I got hurt, right? So the child is figuring out how he feels or she feels based on the reaction of the parent, right? So this social referencing can get a child to either feel I'm okay or I got hurt based on the cues of the important attachment figures. So it's not hard to extrapolate just this one little piece of scientific research that a parent can signal to a child, let's say during a transition, right? If they signal with their body posture or facial expression that the other parent is disgusting or scary, that the child's going to pick that up and be unaware. Okay, and so that's our first little thread of research on social influence. Okay, Stephen Ceci has done a lot of really interesting research. He asked children in one of his studies whether an event, a highly improbable event, say like get your finger caught in a mousetrap, ever happened. And just by coming in once a week and sitting with the child and saying, did your finger ever get caught in a mousetrap? After a couple of weeks, the kids who started off saying, what are you talking about? I don't even know what a mousetrap is. All of a sudden, they're like, yes, it happened. So a high percentage changed their response just based on repeated questioning. And then two very important things, particularly relevant for us, happened in his research study. The first is that the children added sensory details to the memory. They didn't just say, yes, it happened. They said, I was in the basement and I was rolling around with my brother and I flung my finger out and it got caught and it hurt and I smelled this and thought this and this is what I was thinking and this is what happened. And they're packing a false memory with loads of sensory detail. And it's just those sensory details that child protection or the guardian ad litem or the attorneys for the minor children get hung up on when they say it must have happened. The kids told a whole story about it, right? Well, it turns out that under some circumstances, children will elaborate sensory detail even to events that never happened. The other thing that Stephen Ceci learned, which I think was a surprise to him, is that once he debriefed the children and he explained, you know, your finger never got caught in a mousetrap, it didn't actually happen. The kids didn't say, oh, gee, thanks for pointing out that that was a trick or that wasn't true. You know what they said? No, it really happened. Because once that false memory is in their brain and they've attached it to sensory detail, it feels like a real memory to them. And there's these hilarious videos of these children like arguing with Stephen Ceci. No, my finger really was in a mousetrap. All right. And again, we can see how that could relate to alienation. Once that child believes that abuse happened, it's very, very hard to disabuse them, if you will, of that notion. Okay. Moving through our social influence research, Elizabeth Loftus, she studied how to implant false memories deliberately in people. She also showed that simply how you ask a question can change somebody's memory of an event. So she showed people videos of a car hitting, I think, a pole. And it's the same video. She showed it to two groups. One group, she interviewed them afterwards and said, how fast was the car going when it smashed into the pole? And another group, she said, well, how fast was the car going when it hit the pole? The only difference was the word smash, which obviously sounds elaborate and, intense and severe, as opposed to hit, which is a little bit more neutral. And then people were asked to estimate how fast the car was going. and to add, to describe it. And the people who heard the word smashed in the question estimated the car was going faster. They imagined there was broken glass all over the place. They, again, elaborated these details that were not there, right? So how we ask questions of children affects the memory that they have. Okay, it can actually go back and change the memory. In her famous Lost in the Mall study, Elizabeth Loftus showed you could actually implant an entirely elaborated false memory in people that when they were children, they had been lost in the mall. And again, they held on to these memories and it seemed very, very real to them. Okay, Shaw and Porter, this video is online. I highly recommend it. What they did was they took teenagers and they asked, could we implant a false memory of a highly salient, unlikely event? So take Lost in the Mall. Maybe everybody would say, yeah, maybe I was lost in the mall when I was a child. It was a long time ago. Maybe it happened, right? So they wanted to test how extreme can we go to implant a false memory. So they took teenagers and they implanted a false memory of having like a fist fight with their best friend and the police were called just a little while ago. And you would think, like, how can you do that? How can you take somebody and make them believe something highly improbable, right? Like having a fight with your best friend and the police being called. You would think that people would say, no, that didn't happen. 75% of the people in her study, and you can watch it happening online, right? Where they are starting to imagine that it happened, and then by the end, they're like, yeah, I can imagine this happened, and then this, and again, they're packing these false memories with sensory detail. And I like this quote that they said, that what might have been became what was. So they're basically rewriting people's memories. Okay, going back in time, probably everybody knows the Solomon Asch study on social influence of college students. Okay, so the last study was on teenagers, and the visual cliff is studies with infants, so we're sort of moving up to adults. All right, he put a group of college students together and he showed them a line, just a line on a piece of paper, and he said, okay, we're going to go around the room and everybody tell me which of these other lines matches that first line. You would think that'd be pretty easy. It wasn't like gradations. We're talking about pretty big differences here. It was pretty clear which was the match. Only one person in the room was actually a research subject. Everybody else was Confederates. They were in on it, right? And everybody goes around the room and they pick the wrong match. And by the time they get to our poor research subject, he's in a quandary, right? What do I do? So a vast majority of them say the wrong line, okay? And what's interesting is he interviewed them afterwards, and some of them said, like, oh, I just wanted to go along. I didn't want to stand out. I didn't want to be the only one to say it was A was the match when everybody else said B. But some of them actually said, you know, I got confused. I didn't know what was right anymore. I couldn't tell. I doubted my own perception based on the influence of the group. Okay. And again, Stanley Milgram, there's been movies and books written about him. He did a study that would never be allowed to be done today, but he manipulated people into thinking that they were giving very, very high voltage, painful shocks to people. He wasn't actually, the shocks, the machine was actually a fake, right? But there was somebody on the other side of the machine moaning and groaning and saying, like, I'm going to have a heart attack, I'm dying. And the people would still turn up the knob based on an experimenter saying, you need to do it. You said you were going to be part of the study. You need to continue. Please continue. There was no overt coercion. Not, we're going to arrest you. You're a bad person. There was nothing overt. It was just, you said you would do it, and I'm counting on you to do it. Now please turn the knob up. And I think it's something like 75% of the people did it to the highest degree. And the box said something like, danger will kill the next, you know. So it's amazing what people can be manipulated to do. And these are adults, right? And what they said is, I felt obligated. I felt like I had to do it. Okay, so what does this sort of mean for us? So false memories can be planted. Suggestive Questions can lead to the corruption of memory and perception. The cues of others shape our own perceptions, and this is true of infants, children, teens, and even adults. Okay? So I just want to talk a little bit about some of these mechanisms. So social pressure, and that you can see how that comes to bear in the Milgram experiment. People felt pressured to turn up the knob, or the Ash experiment, people felt pressured to say the wrong line. Okay? So brain scan research shows that it doesn't feel good to go against the group, right? We're actually hardwired to feel discomfort in our brains if we're the only one saying, no, no, B is the match, and everybody else is saying A, okay? As a society, we're held together sort of by a social contract of sort of going along, right? And that actually is now in our DNA. And so you can imagine a child, just to bring it obviously back to alienation, where all the other siblings are already alienated, it's going to be really hard for that kid to say, no, no, I still want to visit mom or dad. I don't care about what everybody else says, right? It's also related to alienation and how the favored parent brings a community of support for their position, right? It's maybe they're remarried and it's their new spouse, or it's their families or their friends or the neighbors. And eventually, what does the kid start to think? Everybody agrees with mom, dad's a jerk, right? It's not just mom versus dad, which would sort of be equal, right? The favored parent marshals all of this support. And the targeted parent is sort of alone in their sort of their relationship with the child, because ultimately the kid will cut off contact with everybody who could be connected to the targeted parent, right? So visualization. So one of the ways that Shaw and Porter implanted the false memory was by asking their research subjects to imagine the event happening. So they would say, okay, so you don't think you had a fist fight with your best friend Sally 6 months ago? Well, just close your eyes and imagine that it happened, right? And if you imagine something enough, your brain has a trace of that. And then when you remember that imagining, your brain can't tell the difference between imagining something, remembering something you imagined, and remembering something that actually happened if you remember it a lot, right? And so you can imagine favored parents not overtly saying to their child, I want to plant a false memory, but saying, well, what was it like when your mother, did this or that? I want some details. Tell me how this happened. And eventually the child can come to believe something just by visualizing it in their mind. Okay, we also know suggestive questioning is something that favored parents do, right? And just how you ask a question can change the memory. So Loftus did this study, and it might even been the same one with the car crash, where she asked people about a stop sign. Was there a stop sign in the video or not? And half the people she asked, did you see a stop sign? And half she asked, did you see the stop sign? Okay? Who knew, right? But the people who were asked, did you see the stop sign, were much more likely to remember seeing a stop sign that was not there than people who were asked, did you see a stop sign? Okay, so subtle wording can really change our perception. And again, we can imagine favored parents asking the child, not what did you have for dinner, just as an example, when you were with dad, but did you have dinner? Right? A totally different meaning is packed into that question, right? One is, hey, I'm interested in, your life and your day-to-day experience. And the other is, are you being starved by the other parent? So very subtle, different words can really affect our memories. Okay, we know that repetition really can affect memory, simply being asked the same thing over and over again. So the parents who interrogate their child and ask these intense questions over and over and over again can create a feeling in the child that something is true when it's not. We know persuasion and manipulation is a big part of this. Milgram showed that creating an expectation of compliance was all that was needed to get a child, an adult, to do something that they really did not want to do. So parents who get their kids to promise me you'll call me, promise me this, promise me that, tell me that you're going to do it, I'm counting on you to do it, can create an expectation that the child feels that they have no choice. Okay, patternicity, we know that our brains are wired to make connections, and so simply asking two questions that might not seem related can create a false belief in the child. And confirmation bias. Once that false idea is planted in the child that the other parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable, it's very, very hard to undo it, because the brain is oriented to give more weight and pay more attention to information that supports our beliefs rather than information that goes against our beliefs, because we don't want to have to change our mind. And I think one of the things that favored parents are really good at is creating situations in which, because of confirmation bias, the child's going to think mom is right, dad's a jerk, right? So just as an example, if the child asks the targeted parent, don't come to my soccer practice, right? Typical thing, I don't like the way you look in the bleachers, you're weird or whatever. And then the parent doesn't come, the kid can think, gee, that parent really doesn't care. And if they do come, it's, gee, they don't respect my voice and my wishes, and they're not honoring me because they're coming. So it's just one of those sort of situations where no matter what the targeted parent does, it's going to confirm the negative message, right? The parent who pursues the child is harassing and stalking, and the parent who doesn't is abandoning and doesn't care, right? So there are all of these situations that targeted parents have to navigate, where it seems that no matter what they do, they're going to be confirming the bias in the child that the targeted parent is bad. Okay, so the 17 primary parental alienation strategies use these influence techniques to induce in the child this distorted belief that the other parent is unsafe, unloving, and unavailable. That is the essence of parental alienation, right? The child comes to believe that that other parent doesn't love them, doesn't care about them, isn't available emotionally for them, okay? And the flip side of that is they induce in the child the belief that the favored parent is the only one who really loves them and cares about them. And when you have those twin false beliefs, right? Mom doesn't love me, dad's the only one I've got, then you're going to have a kid who's going to be willing to forego a relationship with the targeted parent, right? So it results in the cohesion and enmeshment with the favored parent, and then the child feels that they have no choice but to forego the relationship with the targeted parent in order to please the favored parent, who's now the only parent they have. Okay. So what I want to do now, I have no idea how I'm doing on time, so give me a second. I think I'm doing okay. So what I want to do now is talk about the 17 primary parental alienation strategies and the science underlying them in particular. Okay, so back in around 2004 or 5, I started getting interested in parental alienation, and one of my first questions was, how do they do it? How does a parent take a child who has a good relationship with a parent and turn them against the other parent? What are the specific behaviors? We now know the social influence science that explains in some way part of the how do they do it, but I wanted to know, what are the specific behaviors? What are they doing, right, to turn a child against the other parent? And so the first thing that I did was I interviewed 40 adults who self-identified as somebody who, when they were a child, was manipulated by one parent to turn them against the other parent. Obviously, I didn't use the word parental alienation. I don't think any of the 40 people I interviewed had ever heard of that term. In fact, years later, when I finished the book and I wrote it and I sent them each a copy of the book and I kept in touch with them, one of the first things they said was like, oh, I thought I was the only person who had this experience. I didn't know it had a name, right? So one of the things I asked them was, how did your mother turn you against your father? How did your father turn you against your mother? And these were interviews. I audio taped them, I transcribed them, and then I spent the next 6 months cutting out little snippets of information and putting them on index cards and then sorting the cards. And I had these piles, and then I sorted the piles. And ultimately what I came up with was about 12 different behaviors that the adults who lived through this said the other parent did to get them to believe that the other parent was no good. And that was our first sort of cut at the specific behaviors. And then Doug Darnall and I did a study where we surveyed about 100, I think it's 97 targeted parents, and we asked them, make a list of everything that you think the other parent is doing to turn your child against you. And they happily complied, and I think we ended up with 1,300 different things. And Doug and I independently sorted them into different buckets because some things sort of hung together. And then when we were done, we had about 12 or 20, whatever it was, list of behaviors. So there's, saying bad things about me to my child, making it hard for me to communicate with my child when they're with the other parent. We sort of know in general what they are. So I had the list of the adults who lived through it and the list of the parents who were going through it now. And of course, there was a lot of overlap. And there were a couple things that only the parents going through it knew. And there were a couple things that only the kids who lived through it knew, but there was a lot of overlap. And so the next study I did was with a master's student, Jacqueline Chambers, and we combined the lists. And we had, again, I don't remember the original number when we started, 20, let's say, and then we sort of took it out into the field and we interviewed people who were adults of divorce or parents going through divorce now. And we said, do you know what this means? Can you understand what we're trying to get at here? And through this iterative process, we ended up with the Baker Strategy Questionnaire. And that has 20 items, and it's basically the 17 primary parental alienation strategies that are sort of teased apart in a slightly different way, because that's sort of how you have to do it sometimes in a research study. And it's 19 specific parental alienation behaviors, and then the 20th item says, when you were a child, did one of your parents try to turn you against the other parent? Sort of the essence of parental alienation. And then the first 19 items are specific behaviors. And I have spent the last, 5, 7, whatever years studying this measure and in different populations. So I think there's 8 different studies that I've done, completely different samples, which resulted in 13 papers. All told, it was roughly 2,500 different people who participated in the research, which was done in New York and Texas and Chieti, Italy, and other places as well. And we've used this measure now with adults and teens. So the teens are talking about what's happening in their life now. Adults are when you were a child, did this happen to you? And in every study, this measure seems to work pretty well. And it's free, anybody can use it, so I really would love other people to start using it. But I just want to tell you a little bit about how it is that we know that it's reliable and valid. And those are the 2 scientific terms we use for basically, it's a good measure, okay? The measure has to be reliable and it has to be valid. So the ways that we tested this is, first we asked, if it's measuring parental alienation, then we would hypothesize that everybody who said yes to item 20, yes, one of my parents tried to turn me against the other parent, would have higher scores on the other 19 items than those who didn't endorse item 20. Does that make sense? Right? Okay, so yes, that turns out to be true to a whopping extent, right? So that means that those 19 items are pretty much measuring parental alienation. One parent trying to turn them against the other parent. Okay, another piece of the reliability and validity is we would imagine that those who come from divorced and separated families would have higher scores on all 20 items than those who come from intact families. Now we know alienation does happen in intact families, but not quite to the extent. So the hypothesis was everybody, if you divide your samples into 2 groups, divorced or separated, not, the scores on the BSQ, all 20 items would be much higher than in the group who did not have separated or divorced families. And in every single study, that turns out to be the case. All right? So we can say with a fair degree of confidence at this point that this is a pretty good measure of the 17 primary parental alienation strategies. Okay. To be clear, other people have their own versions of this measure. Hans and Warshak published a study. They called their measure the Parental Alienation Behavior Scale, and it's pretty much a lot of overlap with the Baker Strategy Questionnaire, and they found the same thing. Those from divorced families are going to rate these items more highly than people from non-divorced families. So there's also 2 other studies, and I think I'm going to just jump to the end for a moment. We definitely need more research on and either people using the existing measures or coming up with their own. Okay, I want to talk for a little bit about the 8 behavioral manifestations. Okay, so Gardner coined the term parental alienation syndrome. He's the one who identified these specific behaviors. These are the terms that he came up with to describe the cluster of behaviors that children who have been manipulated by one parent to unjustifiably reject the other parent exhibit. But as Bill said this morning, this is a phenomenon. It probably goes back to the Bible, right? I mean, as long as there are 2 people who can't get along and have children, there are going to be some elements of parental alienation. So Gardner coined the term and he came up with these labels, but as soon as he did, other clinicians immediately started writing papers saying, I've seen the same thing in my custody evaluation practice, or I'm a family attorney and I see the same thing, you know, in the children of my clients. And there was a pretty strong, I would say, groundswell of support among other clinicians working in this field, seeing the same thing. Even earlier, Wallerstein and Kelly wrote a seminal book on children of divorce, and they have a great quote. I'm going to see if I can find it. They talked about children who were faithful and valuable battle allies in efforts to hurt and punish the other parent. They had turned on the parent they had loved. All right, so this was, again, a phenomenon that we know exists well before Gardner coined the term. And Kelly and Johnson, as Bill said in his talk, they challenge certain elements of parental alienation theory, but when push comes to shove, and they start writing about the behaviors of alienated children, they are basically just using Gardner's language, right? They are talking about exactly the same 8 behaviors that Gardner was talking about. Okay. In terms of measuring the behaviors, Bill, could you tell me how much time I have left? What? Not fair. Okay. I'm going to skip this. And what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the science underlying these 8 behaviors. Okay? So I want to go back for a second. Okay. So these are the behaviors that alienated kids exhibit. And one of the things that we say all the time in the field is that even abused children, even children who have been abandoned, beaten, molested, treated very, very badly by a parent, do not exhibit these behaviors towards the parent who abused them. Okay? And I want to just talk a little bit about how we know that to be true. Okay, so first of all, there's lots of writings by people who do therapy with abused children. And what they talk about is how hard it is to get abused children, to even be a little bit annoyed with the abusive parent and confront the abusive parent. They're not coming in like alienated children, you know, with 2 guns blazing saying, I hate that parent, right? The problem, if you read books on how to do therapy with abused children, is how to get them to even confront the parent at all, okay? There's some fascinating research with rats that I'm going to skip over because I don't have enough time. Harry Harlow, most people know his research on the wire monkeys and showing that baby monkeys need comfort. What many people don't know is he actually did a study using what he called monster mothers. What he wanted to do was figure out how bad can a parent be before the little baby monkey will reject it. And the answer is you basically can't get a baby monkey to reject an abusive parent. So he created these mechanical, horrible mother monkeys to fling their babies across the cage and have spikes coming out of them. And the babies, what do? They just cling to the abusive mommy, okay? In fact, they cling more to the abusive mom than the baby monkeys raised by non-monster mommies cling to those moms. So actually, abuse induces clinging, proximity seeking, and comfort seeking, right? Not the other way around. Okay, There's some research on foster children who were interviewed, and what do they say? They miss the parent who abused them. They want to go home. They don't want to be in foster care, right? I don't know any kid who said, like, yay, I'm being removed from home, I'm going to go into foster care, right? I mean, in general, they're like, when do I get to go home, right? And these are kids who are separated from abusive parents, okay? There's tons of memoirs written by adult children who were abused, right? Adults who were abused when they were children, and they talk about how much they loved that abusive parent, how all they want is for that parent to say, I'm sorry, and they would welcome that parent back into their lives. They're desperate to have a relationship. The memoirs are very loving portraits of the abusive parent. 2 minutes, I got you. Tomorrow, I'm going to be talking about new research, so I'll just give you a little highlight for those who won't be in the research track. We just finished a study surveying over 300 clinicians, asking clinicians with expertise in working with severely physically abused children. And we asked them, do those kids, are they rude to the abusive parent? Do they have weak reasons for being mad at that parent? Do they worship the other parent? Basically, we asked them versions of the 8 behavioral manifestations of alienation. And I'm going to just sort of summarize briefly to say that the research clearly supports that abused kids do not exhibit the behaviors that we now know are highly specific to parental alienation. With only 1 minute left, I'm going to skip, and I'm going to skip that. I'll just go back and say there's lots of research now linking parental alienation behaviors on the part of a parent to bad outcomes for kids. Okay, that's a big piece of the research I've done, is linking scores on the Baker Strategy Questionnaire to depression in the adult children, anxiety, low self-esteem, problems with substance abuse, insecure adult attachments, and difficulties being self-sufficient. Exposure to parental alienation strategies on the part of a parent is bad news for the kids, okay? And just to end, we need more research, more studies on the behaviors of alienated children. We need to do more longitudinal research. Right now, everything has been retrospective. I'd love to see some research on the efficacy of prevention, right? How do we spare these children and families from this rather than just studying the bad outcomes? I'd love to start studying how we can prevent it. And I'm going to end there.